Pillay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand and speak on the Court's Remote Participation Bill, along with my colleagues, and along with them, Mr. Speaker, share their concerns that we've heard the previous speaker and again other speakers talk about the efficiency gains with this bill. But I would say to the House, Mr. Speaker, that we haven't really seen any evidence about inefficiency under the current system. And we in Labour are not fundamentally opposed to the use of remote participation. Rather, we believe that in this instance, with new technology, with new ways, that it is really important to err very strongly on the side of caution. We have efficiency, access to justice, the arguments on one side, but on the other we have the very important principle that justice is seen to be served. And the question that my colleagues have raised, and indeed I do, is the right to the accused to be present in the court to put their case and to participate fully, because by remote participation, Mr. Speaker, one is not able to participate fully, and also from the rights of victims to have the right to confront the accused. Certainly, we on this side of the House had no problem whatsoever if that by consent that the parties that AFL was used in substantive criminal proceedings. Our concern is rather that it can happen. It does not require consent from either the accused or the victim, and we think at this stage, at this very early stage, that is a bit very risky, Mr. Speaker. And if we look, that certainly this government has taken some risks, or has really let nothing stand in its way in terms of implementing legislation, no matter how unprincipled or how inappropriate that legislation may be. That's right, says my friend and colleague Darian Fenton. If we look at the ridiculous three strikes legislation, Mr. Speaker, an absolute joke of legislation, the Ministry of Justice was actually prevented from providing good advice to the Law and Order Committee. What do we see happening around Christchurch in terms of disbanding ECAN? Again, running roughshod over, not applying caution, not the key principles of democracy and justice. And of course, in our home turf, the abysmal situation of Auckland, where all the concerns that Aucklanders have raised, as have many through the Select Committee process with this bill, have been largely ignored. And that's not good for democracy, Mr. Speaker, and it's also not good for justice. And it is indeed a very, very worrying trend. We are not saying, Mr. Speaker, that there are not worthwhile measures in this bill and that AVL is inappropriate to use. We are certainly not saying that. But we are very disappointed. We believe, certainly in Labour, along with my colleagues, the Honourable David Parker and Jacinda Ardern and me, is that we like to think we're pretty well considered, certainly very reasonable people, very reasonable. And I think that nobody in this House would say that either David Parker, Jacinda Ardern or me are unreasonable people. I don't think that there has ever been any evidence of that. And it is really rather sad, Mr. Speaker, that the very constructive points that we raised, that were actually raised by the Human Rights Commission and the Law Society, were largely ignored, and that perhaps a bit more of open-minded attitude from the National Party, we would have seen, and some minor changes, we would have seen a bill that we would have been very happy to support in this House. And I think that the loss of the ability to for the National Party to listen and take those concerns on board is a lose-lose. It's a lose in terms of the good parts of the legislation going forward, and it's also a lose in terms of justice, not only on behalf of the accused, but also on behalf of the victim not being served. And I think it's pretty rich, Mr. Speaker, when it comes from a government who actually boasts ad nauseum about how committed they are to victims and victims' rights. And we saw releases today. Hogwash, says William Seo, and I agree with him completely. Because if this was a government that was committed to seeing justice served and seeing victims truly cared for, then we wouldn't see the debacle that we are seeing at the moment with ACC. And I found it inappropriate that we have a Minister of ACC, Mr. Speaker, who is an absolute shocker. I would say, and I'm not talking about national, I would say that Nick Smith, I would say from every Minister of ACC, and there's been some doozies in the National Party, but I have to say that he would be the worst Minister of ACC. Why? Because that minister has completely disregarded the voice of victims in New Zealand. And I can see Paul Quinn nodding his head and looking really perturbed because he's a man with a conscience. But I think also, Mr. Speaker, well, okay, maybe I've gone a little too far, but I know he's sympathetic, and I know also that the Minister of Justice, if the Minister of Justice spent a little more time listening to people, listening to victims in this country, and a little less time trying to hurry through legislation that at the end of the day is not going to serve justice or not see justice served fully in this country. And I want to acknowledge the Law Commission, because they gave a very, very good submission, as indeed did the Law Society, and as indeed did many other submitters. And nobody here, including those submitters, objects to efficiency and, as I said before, access to justice. Rather, their concern is about the substantial departure, and I'm quoting here, in judicial process. It's broad in its scope, and it does not appear to be based on any evidence of the potential impact. And that is quite true, because we know that that the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, I thought put up a very common sense a suggestion, and that, Mr. Speaker, was that there was a trial period. Now, what would be wrong with a trial period? It's like national standards in schools. If all the evidence, if you are going out on a limb, if it's something that looks like it is not going to be a win, then surely it is logical to have a trial period. Why? Because with a trial period, then if it's not working, then it can be rectified. And we on this side of the House are very interested in working with the government on where things aren't working. The only problem is at the moment is no thing's working. Whether it's education, whether it's law and order, whether it's justice, whether it's health, it's all a shambles. And there comes a point, Mr. Speaker, where this government just has to take note of the damage that they are causing, and really whilst this bill certainly doesn't have the implication of many of their policies, it is something that, had the government been prepared to listen, that the concerns that we in Labor had could well have been rectified, and we could have had a meeting of the minds on that. So I'm really sad, Mr. Speaker. I'm really sad that we are not able to support this bill, that we know that sorry, I didn't hear that we do believe in justice, we do believe in access to justice, and we certainly believe in efficiency. But this bill is untested, unproven, and really cuts into the very rights of both accused people and victims in New Zealand. And I hope that in a short while the government will give careful consideration